Six-Day War of 1967 left Israel in control of 3 times as much territory as she had before the war. With the repossessed territory, Israel had also inherited an Arab population of more than 1 million people, which concerned Israeli leaders. The government of Prime Minister Levi Eshkol stated their readiness to hand over much of the territory gained in the war if the Arab states finally agreed to end their 20-year jihad against the Jewish state and recognise her right to exist in peace. In September 1967, the defeated Arab leaders met in Sudan and vowed that they would not negotiate, they would not recognise, and they would not make peace with the Zionist enemy. 2 months after the solemn promise by the Arab state never to make peace or even recognise the Jewish state, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 242. This resolution, together with the subsequent Resolution 338, after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, have both been the topic of much debate.
Security Council Resolution 242 specifically refers to the need during the course of the peace process, the negotiations, to establish secure and recognized boundaries.
It was intended to be, and has been used by the parties, as a roadmap for peace agreements.
Now, this is not a mandatory resolution. It was adopted according to Chapter 6 of the United Nations Charter, which is the chapter that deals with a peaceful settlement of disputes.
What's interesting about 242 is that it saw the conflict, the way everyone saw it at the time, as a conflict between the Arab states and Israel. Now, as we know, at the time, there was no Arab state called Palestine. In fact, there never has been in history an Arab state called Palestine. And so it receives no mention in 242. 242 is interested in peace agreements between Israel and its neighbors.
What's notable about the resolution is that it basically says nothing concretely. It certainly says nothing about the Palestinians. It says nothing about borders. It has a general principle that Israel should withdraw from some of the territory it has occupied, and the British in particular were very keen on insisting that the language not be all of the territories or the territories, but rather that some Israeli territorial withdrawal should be made in exchange for peace and full recognition by its Arab neighbors.
If you read Resolution 242, as opposed to listening to the cherry-picked bits that you usually see in conversation, what Resolution 242 does is it says there are several principles that we ought to follow, such as the principle that every state has a right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. And then it gives some elements that it thinks ought to be in an ultimate peace treaty. And one of these elements is withdrawal of Israeli forces from territories occupied in the 1967 conflict. And there are other elements in there, the termination of claims of belligerence, the end of Arab blockades of Israel and the like. All these are elements that were supposed to be in an ultimate peace agreement.
In November 1977, the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, made a historic visit to Jerusalem to begin peace talks with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. The visit resulted in a peace treaty signed between the two nations at Camp David in 1979. Similarly, a peace treaty was signed with Jordan, which by this time had renounced all territorial claims to the West Bank and East Jerusalem in favour of the people now called the Palestinians.
Jordan, during its occupation of that territory before 1967, was not a legitimate sovereign. There is a Latin phrase, ex injuria jus non oritur, which means that illegal acts cannot create law. So in other words, a legal right or entitlement cannot arise from an unlawful act or omission. Now this means that a right cannot arise from wrongdoing, and so this principle makes clear that Jordan's illegal seizure of that land cannot ground any legitimate claim to the territory.
Because Jordan had no legal claim to the territory, its supposed transfer of the so-called West Bank to the Palestinians was therefore completely unlawful. It was like handing over stolen property.
Israel and Egypt used 242 in their peace agreement, and Israel and Jordan used 242 in their peace agreement. But 242 doesn't create any Israeli obligations towards the Palestinians at all, because they simply weren't recognized as part of the problem.
Since then, Israel has withdrawn from well over 95% of the territory taken, in particular the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, small parts of the Golan Heights, and small parts of the West Bank. On the other hand, it has not received this general recognition.
The Security Council Resolution 242 of November 22, 1967 is often referred to as the source of rights and obligations for the parties in the Middle East. If I focus on Jerusalem, I take the position that, again, rights have been granted based on the recognition of historical rights, based on the principle of reconstituting what the Jewish people used to have. The Jewish state and the Jewish people have done nothing to relinquish, surrender the rights that were given in respect to that territory. And although many Israeli leaders have indicated that they were prepared to recognize the basic principles of Resolution 242, there's nothing in that resolution that makes it necessary to give up Jerusalem.
On the 30th of July 1980, the Knesset, the Parliament of Israel, voted overwhelmingly in favor of a bill proclaiming that Jerusalem is the complete and indivisible capital of Israel.
We are united, namely that Jerusalem must remain one city as the capital of Israel.
No doubt that many people in Israel supported the bill because of certain provocations against Israel that were taking place in the international arena, including United Nations, in Europe and in Egypt, that these provocations were aimed to put a question mark on Jerusalem as a united city.
They wanted to make clear that they considered the whole reunited city, including the old city and East Jerusalem, as part of the capital forever. And this is a decision that enraged the nations. The United Nations condemned it and said all nations should refrain from having their diplomatic missions in Jerusalem. But it was actually the threat of an oil embargo that pressured the last 13 embassies in Jerusalem to leave for Tel Aviv.
On the 20th of August 1980, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 478. The resolution denounced the Basic Law passed here by the Knesset, declaring it to be in violation of international law and stating that it sought to alter the character and status of Jerusalem. Of course, the illegal invasion by Jordan and its ethnic cleansing of the Jewish population, which altered both the character and status of Jerusalem in 1948, was ignored.
So the Security Council resolution is adopted on the false premise that the Basic Law had worked some fundamental change in the status of Jerusalem. And it's predicated on taking measures to invalidate that supposed new status. It is a misunderstanding and a misstatement on the nature of Israel's legislative activity. And the resolution is fundamentally flawed.
14 of the 15 members of the Security Council voted in favor of the resolution. The United States abstained, even though Secretary of State Edmund Muskie believed the resolution was indeed fundamentally flawed.
Whereas, say, the U.S. State Department does not call the territories occupied territory, the the Palestinians have managed to get the international community as a whole, the majority, to talk about Israel's illegal occupation, including of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. But under international law, that has no real basis, but they speak of the illegitimacy of Israel's presence there, that it's an illegal, illegitimate occupation, but this is a legal fiction. It has no basis in international law.
UN Security Council Resolution 478 is not binding legally. The United Nations is chiefly a political organisation rather than a lawmaking one. There is a big misconception that needs to be addressed, which is that UN resolutions are generally not a source of law. The legal status of a UN resolution is determined by the chapter of the UN Charter under which it's made.
Resolution 478 was a Chapter 6 resolution, not Chapter 7, and therefore a recommendation and not binding. The resolution censured Israel's basic law on Jerusalem, and it called on those nations with diplomatic missions in Jerusalem to withdraw them from Israel's capital city. The resolution was not without its protesters.
In the summer of 1980, as the last 13 national embassies were abandoning Jerusalem for Tel Aviv, there were Christians gathering for the first big public celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, one of the three main pilgrimage feasts given to Moses in the Bible. And as these 1,000 Christians or so from around 40 countries gathered in Jerusalem, they saw the last diplomats leaving and going down to Tel Aviv. And they said, if our nations aren't going to represent us here, we'll have to represent ourselves. So by the third, fourth day of that week-long gathering, they had found a building and had the beloved mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, come and dedicate the opening of the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem. And we've been here ever since, representing Christians from all around the world who have a heart, a love, a concern for Israel, and who want to stand in solidarity, in particular, with the ancient 3,000-year-old Jewish claim and connection to Jerusalem.
In the next episode of Whose Land, we examine the Oslo Accords of 1993. Did Oslo really guarantee the formation of a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital?